some health educators, policy coordinator, safe to tell, evaluator, child protection, social work intern, CPS caseworker. So thank you for sending that in. I'm going to go ahead and close this poll and share with you all some of those those results of who's in the call with us. So we do have 21% advocates. We don't have any law enforcement personnel with us today, but we do have 8% K through 12 school personnel, 29% prevention educators, and 42% other. And so a lot of those were things that I read off. A lot of CPS caseworkers, child protection, law enforcement victim advocates. So thank you all for being here today with us. We hope that this information will be very helpful and useful for you all. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to our presenter for today. Like I mentioned, Margaret Ochoa. She'll be talking to us about juvenile sexting prevention. Margaret?
Thank you so much, Maria. And I just want to take a minute to thank the entire CCASA staff, because they are working hard, especially with the legislative session open right now. Just wanted to thank them for all the resources they provide survivors and all the policy work they're doing to protect the community. I wanted to tell you all a little bit about myself. As you can see from the screen, I am the Child Sexual Abuse Prevention Specialist with the Colorado School Safety Resource Center. We're a small agency within the Department of Public Safety, and we do all work related to positive and safe school climates. You can see what my content area is, but we also have people that can come out and do site assessments and work on emergency operations plans with schools, in addition to our school outreach consultant who does bullying and suicide prevention work and all things mental health related. So all of our work is free, and if you know or are working with a school that could benefit from those services, please feel free to share our information. We love to get out of the office and are always looking for new people to meet and connections to make. So as Maria indicated, today's webinar is about juvenile sexting prevention. And there are a few objectives that I would like to accomplish in the process of our hour together today. And that, first of all, I'd like you to have an understanding of the history of the juvenile sexting law in Colorado, because it's unique, I'm learning. And there are a lot of other states that are now trying to modify their statutes so that they can replicate the progressive nature of the law that we were able to create in 2017. And again, shout out to CCASA for their involvement in that. Additionally, I want to make sure that you understand that there are 3 new charges that are available under the juvenile sexting statute. I want you to be able to name the affirmative defenses to juvenile sexting. And the last portion of this session will be talking about what we can do with our teen audiences on how to avoid risks and negative outcomes due to juvenile sexting. I had the opportunity with my team to go out on some student staff summits in the last part of 2018, and I did learn what they don't like, and I'll share some of that with you too, because that can be as important as knowing what they are interested in hearing. So before we get into the legal stuff, I want to let you know what we're finding with respect to the data on juvenile sexting. How many kids are doing this? And the chart that you see in front of you, or the bar graph, I should say, is it's a meta-analysis of over 110,000 teenagers that took part in over 33 studies. I think it was about 39 studies. So when this one came out, we were really excited about it. And it's also, you can see the credit here goes to JAMA Pediatrics, so it's a very reliable source. And what it tells us, the blue bars are those bars indicating that sexts were sent, and the green are sexts that were received. On the left-hand side, you can see the sexts that were sent and received with consent, and the right-hand side is without consent. So who was involved in this study? It was kids between 11 and 17, and the mean age was about 15. and about 47% of the kids that participated identified as male. You can see by looking at the bar graph that with respect to sexts that were sent with consent, that resulted about 14.8%, and about 27% had received sexts with consent. On the other side, without consent, sent was about 12% and received was just over 8%. So this tells us a couple different things. It wasn't a huge surprise because the local tests were showing, or the local surveys were showing us about the same thing. But what it does tell us is, no, not everybody is doing this, but a fair amount of kids are. And you can see that there's a pretty good split, especially with regard to receiving sexts, with respect to the abusive nature of it. And this is really important when we start to consider Colorado law and why it is that we've created a felony carve-out in our state. So let's get to it. A little bit of history. If you weren't aware, sexting in all forms with respect to adult sexting, or sorry, with respect to juvenile sexting was a felony prior to 2017. The 2017 juvenile sexting statute, which originally was House Bill 171302, took effect in 2018. So now we have a full year of data that I'm still waiting on. As soon as I have it, I will make it available on the website at the center so that you can see what's changed. There were very few felonies being prosecuted in Colorado, but that threat was out there, and it's a very real threat, and I'll talk about that, what some of the legal consequences of that felony are, because the felony still exists, and it's important for our juveniles to know that that's the case. So the law, as I said, changed in 2018 from a felony to tiered charging, and it applies to juveniles. In Colorado, children are legally culpable for their behavior at the age of 10. So juveniles defined as a person between the ages of 10 and 17 years. This sexting law applies where a juvenile is 14 years of age or less than 4 years younger than the person they're sharing with. In other words, it carves out, it scoops down to age 10 and it scoops up to age 17 when they target age 14. So oftentimes people will ask me, well, does this law apply if two 11-year-olds are exchanging images? The answer is yes. Does it apply if a child is 10 and they're engaging in sexting behavior with a 17-year-old? The answer is no, because there's more than 4 years age difference between them. That would more likely be charged as a felony. If you have questions about that, feel free to put that in the chat box, and I'll get to that when we get to that section of the webinar. I'm a visual learner, and I like to think of the juvenile sexting bill, or now law, as a pyramid. That law, which is Colorado Revised Statute Section 187109, you can see portrayed here, the felony sits at the top, and you can see that the carve-out sits underneath it. The lowest level offense in the juvenile sexting statute being a civil infraction, the next level up being a petty offense, and the top level under the juvenile statute being a misdemeanor. But as I indicated, be very clear that that felony is still out there if a juvenile engages in behavior that is exploitative of much younger children. That's where your DA is going to go in charging, because safety is the primary concern. So let's break these down a little bit. Let's start with a civil infraction. When I say civil infraction, what I want you to think is exchange with consent. And what I'm thinking about, what the law anticipates, is that you have teenagers that are engaged in a relationship and they consensually agree to share images. This is a civil infraction. You can tell by the words themselves that it's not even yet a crime. A civil infraction is punishable by a $50 fine or participation in a sexting education prevention course, much like the one you're sitting through right now. And we've created a free one through the School Safety Resource Center that's available on our website. You can also probably find a free one through your district attorney's offices, if you're a systems advocate. And if you're not, feel free to take a look at ours. The juvenile does have to, or has the capacity to print a certificate of completion at the tail end of that course to prove to their probation officer or the diversion office that they completed it. So back to the civil infraction, this is exchange with consent, and what this looks like in real life. She or he shares a photo with he or she or she or she or he or he. It doesn't matter. Gender isn't an issue, and I don't want you to think that I'm anticipating that this is only happening between males and females. This is happening across all of our identifying groups of teens, and I've heard about a lot of cases across the state where we've got kids that are exchanging images in all different grades and identifying on the LGBTQ or in that community. So just, if you see it, just identify it for what it is. If she shares a photo with him, as I said, could be up to a $50 fine and participation in the course. Next on the pyramid, on the way up, is a petty offense. When petty offense is referenced in the law, I want you to think possession without consent. This is where we've entered criminal territory. A petty offense is a crime. It's a low-level crime, and it occurs when an image is shared with someone without the consent of the person portrayed or depicted in the image. By the way, when I'm talking about images, I neglected to tell you that an image, a sexually explicit image for the purposes of this law, is really specifically defined. But if you think about it in terms of anything under the swimsuit, then you're going to be fine. Especially if you are in a situation where you're educating juveniles about this, you don't really need to get into the graphic details about what is depicted in the image. It's really anything under the swimsuit, and that includes female breasts. So back to the petty offense and possession without consent, what that looks like in real life. You may remember that she shared an image with him with consent, so they've committed a civil infraction. And if he then shares that image with friends and they don't do anything with that image, they just sit with it knowing that she didn't consent, then they're in possession without consent. So there are a couple ways that this petty offense is going to differ with respect to how law enforcement would handle it. In the first place, if they didn't ask for this image and they specifically rejected it, they're really being victimized. So these two individuals at the tail end of the red arrow could also be victims in this case, in addition to the individual who is depicted in the image. But if they have indicated that they want the image, if they've asked for it, if he sends it and they hang on to it and don't take advantage of one of the affirmative defenses, then that's when they can be charged. So what are the affirmative defenses? That is to report to law enforcement or to delete that photo from the electronic device within 72 hours of viewing it. Now, you just heard me say electronic device. The juvenile sexting statute, as you can probably presume, only covers electronic exchange of images. If images are on paper or Polaroid film, we don't have any case law to guide us yet. It's possible we end up back in felony territory there, or it's possible that a district attorney would consider the juvenile sexting statute in charging that even. I really don't know what the result of that will be. But I'm always cautioning juveniles that they don't want to be the first one that has to have the court decide their case. So reporting and deleting are the best option. Certainly reporting is what I encourage juveniles to do, because they don't always know who sent them the image or who's depicted in the image. It might be an adult that's catfishing them. And if that's the case, that's a big safety concern for them. So I suggest report before they delete, and then law enforcement doesn't have the ability to access that evidence, or at least without a warrant and a lot of effort. Coercion is also always an affirmative defense to crime in Colorado, so that's something that kids need to understand. I had a case brought to my attention recently where a 17-year-old was being coerced for images, but was very nervous about reporting it to law enforcement because he said that his partner in a consensual relationship, when the boys were only 15, it was a consensual relationship, and he didn't want to get himself into trouble for sharing those consensual images. And I reminded him that threats and coercion are an affirmative defense here, and it's important to access law enforcement, even the FBI, if this is being done across state lines, or if there's a real threat of extortion. Certainly kids need the assistance of law enforcement, and they're not going to be treated as an offender, they're going to be treated as a victim. So back to our pyramid, we talked about civil infractions being an exchange with consent, petty offense being possession without consent. A petty offense can rise to misdemeanor level if an individual possesses multiple photographs, especially if they are depicting different people. That's usually an indicator to us that we've got a deviant arousal pattern or an abusive pattern that's coming up with this juvenile, and we need to raise the potential charge there to a misdemeanor. A misdemeanor is going to be posting without consent. So it can, when you think about misdemeanor posting, I want you to think about students or juveniles who not only share their own image to people who aren't expecting it, causing emotional distress, but also individuals who are in possession of an image depicting another person, and they then send that image out electronically, either by text or email or any of the social media platforms. An individual can also be charged with misdemeanor if they simply show their camera on their phone or their computer or their device to another individual. So showing a photo is also potentially in misdemeanor territory. Now there are misdemeanor 1s and 2s, and that again goes to the level of abuse. It goes to the level of the amount of photos that are possessed by the individual. So I'm not going to get into all of that because based on the folks that are viewing this webinar, it doesn't look like I have any law enforcement officers or DAs that really need any further legal explanation. We're already pretty down deep into the weeds. So to see what this looks like in real life, again, this is misdemeanor posting. In this example, they shared an image consensually, which was a civil infraction, not yet a crime. He then shares with these friends of his without the permission of the individual depicted in the image. If they hold on to those without taking advantage of one of the affirmative defenses, they are in possession without consent. It's petty offense. So what about him? He obviously is the misdemeanant in this case, and faces the highest potential charge. So there are a couple other things about the law that are interesting and important. One of the things that advocates fought hard for when this bill was being debated was that DAs shouldn't be able to charge the felony and juvenile sexting under the same facts. So if the elements of juvenile sexting are met, and those are the only elements that are met, then the district attorney can't charge the felony and juvenile sexting at the same time, and they can't charge the felony at all if only the elements of petty offense or a civil infraction are met. You can see that the misdemeanor is left off that. And by the way, the handout that was provided in the materials has kind of a charted out breakdown of how this thing is charged. And it's easier to see exactly what the law provides if you want further information on that. The statute does encourage the district attorney's offices to develop diversion programs. There are diversion programs in many of our judicial districts across the state, but some of the smaller districts don't have the resources to have diversion programs. So they've been encouraged to do that, but there's no mandate. Additionally, the courts are required to do an assessment of whether the juveniles involved in the sexting infractions are good candidates for restorative practices. Again, a lot of the DAs don't have restorative practice programs in place. So those that do, I know, for example, in the 20th Judicial District, when Stan Garnett was the district attorney, he reported out to the School Safety Resource Center that they were having great success with their restorative justice practice, and that victims, survivors, and the juveniles who had committed the offensive behaviors all reported that they felt very satisfied at the end of the program, and that they felt that they were heard and that their needs were met. So it's really important that we consider that. And that's, restorative practices are typically not something that we consider in sex offenses, but it does seem to be showing good results for juvenile sexting cases. We are now in 2019 at the benchmark for a 2-year post-enactment review, and we're already talking about it. So if you have any examples of cases where you felt that the juvenile sexting statute did not serve a survivor that you're working with, or any other evidence. For example, when I think about a civil infraction, and much like the example that I gave about the young man who had consensually shared an image, but then was being abused with that image later, it's a little bit scary for the survivor to have to say, yes, I did share this image, but now I'm being extorted with it, because they fear that they are going to face being charged with a civil infraction. The penalty for that isn't large, but for our marginalized populations, $50 can be a lot of money. And you know, I certainly encourage everyone to take advantage of sexting prevention courses, but I think it's pretty easy to predict that many people are just going to pay off a $50 fine to avoid having to undergo investing the time in that course. And it's not likely that people that are impoverished are going to have that choice. So does the law apply equally? So that's a consideration. The last part of the law that is important to know, because it's unique for juvenile offenders, is that there's an automatic expungement of the charge after 42 days. Those that have worked with the sex offender registry and juveniles who have been charged with sexting offenses or any sex offense prior to the enactment of this law know how difficult it is to get a juvenile record expunged. The defense, I'm struggling for the word, the public defender doesn't have authority to expunge records post-adjudication, so it can be difficult for someone to navigate the legal system in order to get their record expunged. So this is one of the positives about this law. So I am now about halfway through the webinar, and I'm going to take a look at some of the questions. And Maria, if something has come up that I need to know about, now would be a great time to let me know.
Yeah, so we do have a few questions that have come in. The first one you touched on a little bit, but just wanted to make sure that the rest of the question was addressed. So how is sexting defined? Is it sexually explicit photos only, or are propositions for sex included as well?
That is a great question. Thank you. I meant to mention that earlier. This comes up pretty frequently. So juvenile sexting has to be the exchange of a sexually explicit image as defined, as I mentioned earlier, by, I'm going to call it the swimsuit zone. So let's think about what else could be happening that could cause distress or could cause worries about whether or not it's legal. So let me just throw out an example. 2 juveniles are engaging in extraordinarily graphic texting, kind of penthouse forum kind of graphic stuff. I want to fill in the blank, or, you know, please tell me a sexy story. That stuff is not included in the juvenile sexting statute. It could potentially be covered by Kiana's law, which is the harassment, cyberbullying harassment law in Colorado. If someone is not welcoming that kind of an overture, then they could request that the contact be stopped, and if it's not, then they could potentially seek redress under that law, but it would not be covered under the juvenile sexting law. Additionally, when I go out and train in high schools, they frequently talk about, oh, the word just went out of my brain. Somebody send it to me. There it is, anime porn. Apparently it's a pretty common thing to find in middle and high schools. It is not covered by the juvenile sexting law. However, this is another thing that might pop up in case law, or it might pop up in under Kiana's law as a harassment if someone is not welcoming it. Think about other things that could come up. I know I've been asked, what about a kid that's drawing penises on a notebook and handing it to someone? That's clearly not covered by the juvenile sexting statute because it is not electronic and it's not depicting a real person. But it could be sexual harassment, certainly. It could be harassment under Colorado's harassment law. Certainly would be a violation of school policy. So think about all the tools that you have in your toolbox. And if you have any other questions about the definition as I've further gone into it, certainly let me know.
Great, thank you. Yeah, another question that came in was, is there a difference if there is a 16-year-old sending and receiving with a 19-year-old?
It's a good question. The 16-year-old would be perceived as a victim in that case because the 19-year-old is an adult. We know that 16 and 19 is not illegal with respect to sexual relationship unless there is like a position of trust relationship between the parties. So it's tough to say what law enforcement would do with that. If a 16-year-old reported that they were being extorted for images by a 19-year-old, clearly law enforcement is going to be interested in that. But if, for example, a 16-year-old's parent picks up a phone and sees images being shared with a 19-year-old girlfriend or boyfriend, it might be tough to get law enforcement to act on that if those young people are engaged in a consensual relationship. And that's usually when we find out about it, is when someone stumbles upon it in checking a phone. But there's nothing inherently illegal between about a 16-year-old having sex with a 19-year-old. So it becomes difficult to get a prosecution on sexting in a case like that, but not impossible. Anything else?
Yeah, so a few more questions. This next one is, what would happen if it was someone who borrowed a phone and then sent a text?
I assume the question relates to what happens to the phone owner. And a lot of us adults should be concerned about that because we all own our phones on our family plans. And if we're in possession of child pornography, that's a concern. But if someone's phone is used to take an image that's then sent from that phone, unless that image is deleted, they take advantage of that affirmative defense, they are going to have a lot of explaining to do as to why that image is existing on that phone. So it's one of the things that came out of our student staff summits was that the kids thought it was a great idea at school to have a digital responsibility day. In other words, everybody sit down with their phone during their study hall or their access period or whatever they call it on this particular day, go in and clean up their phone. Make sure that they change all of their passwords, because we know that a lot of juveniles will have somebody babysit their Snapchat, for example, while they're on vacation so they don't lose their streaks. They don't know what happened to that phone while it was out of their possession, or what happened to their account while it was out of their control. So it's important that they go through, change those passwords and go through all their photos, make sure there's nothing there that they don't want to be there, including their For Your Eyes Only file or folder on their Snapchat account. So those are important things for juveniles to take responsibility for, and I'll hit on that briefly since I've covered it a little bit here in the next portion of this webinar.
Great, Margaret. So we have about 5 or so more questions. Just want to be mindful of time. Is that something that you want to do now or wait until the end?
Why don't you go ahead and if there are questions that I'm going to hit in the next portion of the course, then I'll just defer them.
Perfect. So this next question is expunging only available for misdemeanors and below, or does that include felonies as well?
Just the juvenile sexting statute, which does not include felonies.
Great. And then this next question, as a forensic interviewer, are there elements of information that we would need to have disclosed in order to effectively charge someone?
Can you ask that question one more time?
Yeah, absolutely. So this person, as a forensic interviewer, are there elements of information that we would need to have disclosed in order to effectively charge someone? I'm
not really sure what the question is going to. It sounds like I'm hoping that I've adequately described the elements. So anytime we have a juvenile between 10 and 17 that's exchanging sexually explicit images, if they are more than 4 years in age difference, then we have a victim, no question. And we also have to go through the assessment of what consent means, even if we have juveniles of the same age group. And I know that you're all used to working through that. And I think that the same questions would need to go through your mind if you are interviewing a juvenile and they're reporting to you that they felt pressured or they felt manipulated or they didn't do this using their free will, that there was an element of popularity, or certainly if there were drugs and alcohol that accompanied the taking of those images or the sending of those images. So all of those things would come into play in evaluating the relationship.
Great. And certainly the person who sent in that question, if you wanted a little bit more clarification on that, please do type that in. The next question is, if a juvenile shares a nude picture of themselves on social media or by text, do they fall under the sexting law?
Yes and no. That's certainly, this question has come up because it is a huge concern for that child's mental health. And we need to intervene, but it's unlikely that that child's going to be charged. It really depends on the nature of the image, the age of the child, the sophistication of the child. If it seemed to be something that was directed at someone in order to threaten or intimidate them, even if it was put on a public forum like Instagram, then I think that technically they could be charged. But more likely, we just need to intervene to try to mitigate the damage that that child's doing to him or herself.
Great. This other question is someone sharing an experience of a case that they're working on right now. There's a mother that discovered her daughter took sexually explicit photos and videos of herself. She's 13 years old. The mom reported to this person that she believes her daughter sent the photos to a same age peer. As a CPS worker, would that be something that they would be required to report to law enforcement?
Great question. Yes, is my answer, especially if this juvenile is under 15, because this child is at really high risk, and I would absolutely report it as a part of my mandated reporting obligations, because we, as everybody knows, the age of consent in Colorado is 15. We don't know what the nature of the relationship is. Anytime we see sexting, especially when we learn that people under the age of 15 are engaging in sexual behavior, it's a mandated report. And forgive me, I'm used to speaking to educators. Some of you may not be mandated reporters, but I would absolutely want somebody's eyes on that to make sure that we can mitigate those images. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in the next section on how we mitigate images as well.
Great, thanks. And Margaret, this one's the last question that's come in for now. It says, it mentions on the fact sheet at least 14 years old. What if they are under 14 years old?
Yeah, it does say if they're 14 years old, but the language goes on to say, or less than 4 years younger than the person with whom they're sharing. So a juvenile down to the age of 10 is covered by the statute and is potentially chargeable under the statute because that's the age of legal culpability in Colorado. So the DAs are telling us that it's unlikely that they're going to charge 10-year-olds, but again, I think it's going to depend on the set of facts. So it's very possible. So if that's the last question, I'll go ahead on to the next portion of the webinar, which is how do we work with juveniles when we know what doesn't work. And let me tell you what the kids across Colorado told us doesn't work. What doesn't work is scaring them. What doesn't work is religious or morality-based education. This is school-based, by the way, and because I'm certainly not telling you that, you know, whatever values you want to impart in the privacy of your home, you are entitled to do, and I encourage you to do that. But what they are saying is that in a school-based setting, those messages are hollow. They don't resonate with them. Some of the things that they felt did work, as I mentioned, were the day where everyone takes a pause, takes an hour to look at their devices and improve their digital footprint. Another thing they thought worked was education from older peers. For example, sending high schoolers into middle school to talk about what some of the repercussions can be. They also felt that having trusted adults to talk to who weren't going to judge them was really important and was much more likely to result in their asking for help if they found themselves in trouble and being abused with their images. So let's talk about what's on the screen right now. A couple different tips that I'm going to talk about. We need to talk about the device itself. We need to talk about applications that one puts on the device. And as I already mentioned, kids told us that frightening them does not work. They want to know what's real. And then I'm going to give you some resources at the tail end. So when we talk about the device, this is an image of Mark Zuckerberg, as you probably were already able to identify. And the reason that I love this image when I'm talking to kids is, first of all, they are all about knowing what millionaires and billionaires do and how they've all dropped out of high school and gotten to make their money without any hard work. So, sorry, a little tongue-in-cheek there. It's hard when I don't have a live audience. But the thing I love about this image is that Mark Zuckerberg thinks that it's pretty important to maintain security on his device. Assuming that that laptop is either an Instagram or Facebook employee or Mark's himself, which I doubt, kind of doubting this is his office, you can see that there's tape over both the microphone and the video camera. And that's because these can really easily be hacked. It's there was recently a Huffington Post article where one of the journalists hired a hacker to hack into her home system. And within hours, he was sending her images from her laptop, from her baby monitor, from her security system. So it's really not difficult to do. And you don't know if someone's hacked your camera. So I think that it's a great idea for kids to know that this is a possibility, certainly on their laptops. And it's also possible to hack into phones. They just want to be sure that they're being careful and that they take the precautions that even Mark Zuckerberg would take. So this isn't a conspiracy theory. Next, this image just reminds me to talk about where kids are charging their devices. It is really important that they charge all of their devices with a trusted adult overnight. There's no reason that the kids need to have their devices with them at night. They'll tell you they want to use it for an alarm clock. There are other ways to, there are other clocks that they can use for that purpose. We've also seen a bunch of research that connects lack of sleep, not just with bad decisions with regard to device usage, but bad sleep is correlating really closely with depression, anxiety, and suicidality. So even if you don't want to take control of your kid's phone, those are really valid reasons to take control of your kid's phone so that they're getting enough sleep. So it's important that that take place. Now let's talk about apps just a little bit. When I'm talking to students, I like the image of Somalia, because the first thing that the kids shout out when you show Somalia is pirates. And they're right. Somalia is the land where it's anarchy. There's no discernible governmental structure. And it's important that the apps that they use on their devices have some basis in government. And when I talk about government, I'm not talking about law enforcement. I'm talking about the ability of the application producer, manufacturer, to keep track of where people are at all times. In other words, functionality is the concern. Where we have disappearing photos, disappearing texts especially, we have high risk. If kids are not tethered to their email address or to their cell phone number, then they are in Somalia, in app land. So if you ask the FBI what are the top human trafficking or sextortion applications on social, what are the top social media applications for those crimes, they're going to tell you that it's Instagram, Facebook, Snapchat, all of the biggest applications or the biggest social media sites, just because there are millions and millions of people on those social media sites. The concern for you when you're talking to juveniles is there a way for law enforcement to come to your rescue if you needed it? In other words, if you're texting on Omegle and those texts are just disappearing as you create them, the FBI can't go back in and recreate those. It's really the bane of law enforcement's existence to have these disappearing text applications. So it's important that juveniles stay where they can be rescued. And Snapchat it's easy, even though those are disappearing photos and texts, it's really easy for those to be recreated for law enforcement through a search warrant. So kids think that they disappear, they don't. Adults worry that the evidence has disappeared. It can be relocated. And Facebook and Instagram are the same. Anything that's been deleted from those applications can be discovered through a search warrant because they're tethered. So it's really important to know about that. Geo-targeting apps are risky because they reveal the location of the juvenile, as does a snap map, by the way. Make sure that kids are on private settings, not public settings, because they can be located anywhere. Make sure that they know not to be public on their snap map, because they can be, their GPS can be located so easily, and there might be bad guys out there in the public that they don't know exist. So also, the capacity of having the live stream can also create risk, because if a juvenile has a public account with Musical.ly, Periscope, or Skype, then anybody can reach out to them and chat with them live and share images and text with them live, and that's risky behavior. So the most important thing that we need to talk about with respect to sexting and dating violence and really abusive conduct generally for students and our juveniles is healthy relationships. We have to start with the concepts of consent and empathy very young. Good social and emotional learning programs in early elementary school are really highly recommended, not mandated, but it's important stuff. So when we're talking about consent, what is that? You all know it's the sober, enthusiastic yes. It's the right to control your body. It's freely given and it's repeated. It's never presumed just because someone engaged in sexual behavior that it is, that consent goes on and on forever. Similarly, consent is not a gender-controlled issue. It is not gifts or dinner or sexy clothing or any other victim-blaming category that we can throw in there. A consent is never silence. And we can consent, certainly, with our body language, but it should never be assumed, and it is obviously never forced. Empathy is another really important thing for kids to talk about, to understand what it means to stand in another person's shoes. And that empathy factor is one of the most important things about restorative practices, according to the DAs that use it. It's not until an offender gets in front of their victim or survivor that they suddenly realize really what they and their family went through because of the abuse that they caused. So when I'm training with juveniles, what I like to do is make this into a gallery walk. Let's talk about some of the consequences, because we don't want to do fear-based education. So let's talk about why would there be physical consequences for sexting behavior? And to get there, you have to start with social emotional. When people are embarrassed and humiliated, they can start to engage in social behaviors that have negative outcomes, like drinking, like using drugs to make themselves feel better, to numb the pain that they're in. That can absolutely lead to physical consequences, even self-harm. Academic consequences follow from that, because if someone's ashamed or embarrassed, they often don't want to go to school, or if they're engaged in behaviors that have caused them to be embarrassed with someone at school, they don't want to be there. There are certainly financial consequences to all of this, absolutely, if they're tied up in the legal system. But sometimes, for example, if we start with a felony, there is an inability for students to apply for federal financial aid, to apply for federal housing. They might not be able to live with their younger siblings even. They might not be able to choose a career where they would be around children. They might end up on the sex offender registry for a time or for life. That costs a lot of money to get all of those legal matters extricated. And it can absolutely affect a chosen career, which can have financial repercussions. And the familial consequences that I like to hit on are, you know, is this image something you want your grandmother to see? This is something that can't be unseen. And there's some really good PSAs out there that depict younger siblings stumbling across images. And the decisions that you're making now could affect you in 2 or 3 years, even if it doesn't affect you now, if you're with someone that you trust now. Sometimes people betray that trust. And while it's not your fault, you can make the best decisions now to strengthen your confidence in your digital footprint. So I pulled together a couple PSAs that you may be familiar with. I'm going to show a couple of these. This is one that I would use with a middle school audience because I don't think it's too threatening.
Hey, Sarah. Oh, gosh, so cute. How do you know him? Well, I'm doing like a talk show. Welcome to the tattoo, Sarah. Let's go! Is that Sarah? Sarah in the picture, that's the girl I was telling you about. Oh, that's Sarah? Meet her too on your left. Hey, Sarah. What color underwear to take? Hey, Sarah. So when are you going to post something new?
Anything you post online, anyone can see. Family, friends,
See you later, Sarah.
even not so friendly people. before you post.
So that one obviously gets progressively creepier, but the next one I want to show you is one that I would reserve for high school because I think it's a little dark.
Hi Josh, there's another video from my special guy. I can't believe we haven't talked all day. I wish he went to my school or closer so we could finally meet. I could have been on an hour. Don't spend too long with them. I've already been waiting for this for a while. I wanted to give you something special. It's okay. Who are you? Why are you doing this?
So that one's obviously more disturbing and I don't think is appropriate for a younger audience. I put that in the fear-inducing category, but it's really effective. It shows the deterioration of the young woman who's being extorted, and it does remind students that there is help out there and that they need to access it. The last video that I'm going to show you is a more gentle approach of the same topic, and you could decide what age group this would work with.
Okay, so you did a thing. You sent a picture of yourself with no clothes on. Something you thought wouldn't be shared. And in a polite society, cats wear clothes, right? Anyway, seemed like a good idea at the time. Now things have gone wrong. Terribly wrong. Maybe you shared the picture with someone you loved and trusted, but after a while, things weren't so friendly. Well, they said they'd help you become a star. They just wanted to use you. Or maybe you met someone online and it really seemed to understand you. But then it got weird. And it turned out to be someone totally different. Now the person you shared the pic with is demanding more and threatening to tell you. That's sextortion. Yep, that's a thing. The perpetrator relies on you feeling ashamed and keeping quiet. But they are the ones who should be ashamed. What they are doing is wrong. And it's never too late to find your voice to ask for help. Or too early to reach out to your friends to tell them you'll be there no matter what. In fact, you can stop sextortion before it starts by talking about it now. With support, you can do anything, and you can focus on the important business of being careless. So tell your closest friends today you've got their back no matter what.
So you are going to see at the tail end of the webinar some resources, but one in particular I want to mention is the Cyberbullying Research Center at Florida Atlantic University. You can find them at cyberbullying.org. They are really the foremost experts in the country on maintaining information on cyberbullying, and specifically they do a lot of work on sexting. And one of the things that has come about from our relationship at the center with the Cyberbullying Research Center is that we've learned that it's not difficult to get onto Twitter and Instagram and Snapchat and make them aware that someone's under threat. And if you have somebody that you're working with that is being extorted on Twitter, you can contact Twitter and say, we need you to block this account, and here's the evidence. Hopefully you can get a screenshot of a text threatening one of your survivors, and they can go on and block the individual who's threatening them from using a Twitter account at all. It just helps contain images. Nothing's foolproof, but there are ways to go about protecting people. So that's really important information. And this slide about being a mandated reporter, some of you are, some of you aren't. It's important, just from my perspective, when in doubt, if I come across an image in the possession of a child that shows a mature nude body or an immature nude body that appears to be for sexual gratification, I'm going to report it. I'm going to call the police, because we don't always know what we're seeing, and we don't, the kids don't always know that of which they possess. There may be adults involved that create a risk to them. They may be victimizing someone else, and it's important that we remember we're reporters, we're not investigators. So when in doubt, make that report when you suspect child abuse. Now, I also wanted to take another minute to take any last questions before I make sure we've accomplished our objectives. Do we have anything, Maria?
Yeah, we have one comment. This person just wanted to make sure that that they shared that they had a law enforcement officer tell them that with a warrant they were able to get Snapchat logs from up to 2 years ago. So just wanted to put that out there. And then this is the only question that has come in so far. Is there any pressures being placed on these major apps like Snapchat, Instagram, etc., to educate juveniles about this topic, or even outside agencies running ads on these apps to educate young people?
What a great idea. And in a perfect world, that would be happening. I am not aware of any efforts to do that. But I do know that the platforms have been responsive when the Cyberbullying Research Center has contacted them and said, I've got a kid I'm really worried about. You need to shut this thing down. They've done it. And the FBI is also very responsive. They take calls on extortion cases nearly daily. And in Denver, there's a field office that handles this region. So don't hesitate in contacting law enforcement as an ally in helping contain images, because we know that the outcomes of some of these cases have been very dire, and kids are at very high risk of self-harm because of the pressure that gets placed on them. And thank you, by the way, for that comment about being able to pull up those Snapchat logs for over 2 years, or for up to 2 years. It's really important to remember that they have to be responsive to those search warrants, and they are. Everything I've heard from law enforcement would back that up as well. So these were our objectives. I hope you have a little bit of understanding of the history of the law, that you can name those 3 charges: civil infraction, petty offense, and misdemeanor under this law, and the affirmative defenses being deleting or reporting. And that you've picked up a few things about how to work with teen audiences on reducing risk that aren't just fear-based. The resources that will be provided on the PowerPoint that Maria provides to you are contained here. These are the direct links to those PSAs if you want to take a look at those. They're all on YouTube. And if you want any of my slides when you're presenting a training, please reach out to me. Everything I create, I believe belongs to you as the taxpayers. So feel free to get on our website, steal anything you want, or any part of this presentation. And I just thank you so much for your attention, and thanks again, Maria.
Thank you, Margaret. That was so informative. We had lots of great questions, lots of great information. Thank you all for being here, and especially thank you, Margaret. That was wonderful, and thank you for spending this time with us today. Any questions not answered during today's session, feel free to send Margaret an email, or you can send those to me and I can compile those and send them over to her. And look out for the follow-up email containing the copies of the PDF for the PowerPoint, and also the handout that was shared here. And then we do have a webinar coming up on the 27th called PREA, Understanding the Juvenile Justice System. Teresa Stroud from the National PREA Resource Center will be providing that webinar, again, the 27th from 12 to 1:30, so keep an eye out for that. Please remember to fill out the survey. Those are so helpful for us, and thank you again for attending the webinar.